I learned my first lesson in politics as a Boy Scout in a part of scouting that is known as the Order of the Arrow. This group of scouts typically come from a large geographical area, and the group of which I was a part included many counties in southwest Virginia. The purpose of the Order of the Arrow is to serve in ways that support Boy Scout camps, which, like most things in life, require a lot of maintenance and upkeep. I initially volunteered to serve as the coordinator of all the work on the weekends when we gathered to fulfill our purpose as an organization. The group had several officers that included a president, a vice president, a treasurer, and a secretary that were all elected positions. I decided that I wanted to run for the position of treasurer, and there was another young man from Danville who had made a similar decision. As we announced our intentions, my opponent began to say some very unkind things about me, sort of mudslinging, Boy Scout style. And even Boy Scouts can be ruthless when it comes to politics. As I was descending into that sort of behavior, assuming that's what one had to do in order to get elected, the advisor of our lodge sat me down. His name was George Carr, a man that I will love for eternity because of the ways that he shaped my life. He was a crusty old man who used language that my mother would not have liked. He said to me, "You can't call someone," a word that I cannot say in worship, "if you're going to be," a word that I cannot say in worship. He instructed me not to go where I was headed and to talk more about why I wanted to be the treasurer and what I intended to do if elected. So I did what Mr. Carr told me, and I was elected to the position. On this Sunday after Christmas, less than a week since we celebrated the birth of our Lord, it seems rather inappropriate to enter into a consideration of politics. And I would be the first to say that it's not good politics to preach on politics on the Sunday after Christmas. Believe me when I affirm that I don't really want to do this, and please note that I'm still following the lectionary, which doesn't give me a lot of discretion about what text I use this morning. We heard about the actions of Herod after the visit of the Magi, whose visit we will use as our text next week, which makes no sense to me, but what do I know? The actions of Herod, which I trust we all agree are more than just distasteful and downright evil, is a startling lesson to read just after we sang about the sweet little Jesus asleep on the hay. In his murderous designs, Herod wreaks a lot of havoc and causes a lot of suffering because he views this baby as a threat to his power. We know from historical sources that the Bible is not exaggerating in this regard. Herod killed his own sons and wife when he perceived that they were a threat to him. We're talking about a ruler gone mad. Matthew will frame the life of Jesus in many ways that are designed to make us think of Moses. And this story is just such an instance. When we hear about Herod and his evil actions, as well as the family of Jesus being told to flee to Egypt, it should remind us of Moses, who survived the designs of Pharaoh to kill all the Hebrew baby boys because he thought that the Hebrews were growing too strong. That is, he saw them as a threat to his power. Most of you know that Moses escaped that fate when his mother put him in a basket of reeds and Pharaoh's daughter found him while bathing. God gets one over on Pharaoh when the daughter unknowingly hires Moses' mother to be his wet nurse. Both stories, as I read them, suggest the subversion of politics and seems to teach that God's design cannot be frustrated despite our worst, which some might claim is our best, politics. Given the current political state of our nation on this first Sunday after Christmas, let me be clear that I am not suggesting this morning that one political view represents the will of God, which, given the polls, would indicate that I would alienate approximately half of you. I know no more about the mind of God in all of this than any of you. And just to be clear, I am suggesting that none of us can claim God's endorsement for whatever side we take. Rather, what I'm hopeful that we can all agree on this morning, and which I think is consistent with the text, is that God's purposes will not be frustrated by the worst of our politics. I don't think we are anywhere close to a Herod or a Pharaoh, but that doesn't mean that we can't go there if we get too mean. So I think it may be helpful on this first Sunday after Christmas to affirm that Jesus, that babies whose birth we're still celebrating, is Lord, and that what was given birth at Christmas has greater power than any political designs or actions. The very fact that this greater power comes in the form of a baby seems to immediately signal that we're dealing with a different kind of power. We are accustomed to power plays in the political arena, which can be rather ruthless. What kind of power reveals itself in the birth of a baby, which is about as vulnerable as you can get, other than getting yourself crucified? When we baptize babies, as we have here this morning, I think we immediately recognize that the baby has a certain power over us. When you're singing and I'm carrying the baby, all of you who are awake are smiling, and your eyes are conveying a sense of love. I often just pretend that you're singing to me and looking at me that way. What if we looked at one another that way and saw others looking at us that way? Do you think that we would change the way we go about our politics? Would it create a subversion of politics? In the gruesome stories about what Herod and Pharaoh did to so many babies, I personally would like a God who would come down and do the same to them. This is likely another good reason that I'm not God. I sometimes say to God, when I'm contemplating all the suffering that we inflict on one another, that I don't know how God stands it, and that it must surely break God's heart to see the evil that we perpetuate on one another. God doesn't arrive as a warrior wielding a sword, but as a baby. And when you are singing to that baby during a baptism, you're getting close to the kind of heart that we see in God. Since it's unlikely that we're ever going to agree on what are the best policies for whatever it is that we think our politicians should be working for, is it possible that we can all agree on the ways that our faith would have us treat one another, since we all affirm that we are all children of God? Springfield United Methodist Church, which has an electronic sign that I very much envy, even though we're commanded not to envy, had a recent saying that read, "Although we do not all think alike, we can all love alike." I trust we all have people in our lives whom we love very much and with whom we disagree about important matters. If love is contingent on agreeing about everything important, then it's really not love as I understand love. Love is not dependent on what I do or don't do, what I think or don't think, but what persists, what endures regardless of that. Herod and Pharaoh were much too fearful to rule in that way. And such tendencies, unfortunately, persist in our world. But what God does in these stories challenges us to believe that there is another way. As we contemplate such matters, I want to suggest that David Brooks has some helpful insights in his latest book, The Second Mountain. He cites the work of Hannah Arendt, a philosopher of the 20th century, too little recognized and too little reckoned with. She was writing in the aftermath of Nazi Germany. Brooks relates, when she looked into the lives of people who had become political fanatics, she found two things: loneliness and spiritual emptiness. Loneliness is the common ground of terror, she wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Brooks goes on to distinguish between tribalism and community. He writes, community is connection based on mutual affection. Tribalism, in the sense I'm using it here, is connection based on mutual hatred. Brooks later writes about how relationship is the driver of change. He writes, think of who made you who you are. It was probably a parent, a teacher, or a mentor. It wasn't some organization that was seeking a measurable outcome that can be reduced to metrics. It wasn't a person looking to create a system of change that could scale. It was just a person doing something intrinsically good, making you feel known, cared for, trusted, unconditionally loved, without presuming to know how that relationship would alter the trajectory of your life. Brooks suggests that community builders believe in radical mutuality. They utterly reject the notion that some people have everything in order and others are screw-ups. In their view, we are all stumblers. As W.H. Auden put it, the task in life is to love your crooked neighbor with all your crooked heart. Late in the book, he describes a contrast between Watts and Compton in Los Angeles that suggests the importance of community and relationships. He shares on April 1, 2010, 44% of the low-income black men from the Watts neighborhood of central Los Angeles were incarcerated. 44%. On the other hand, just 6.2% of the men who grew up with similar incomes in the Compton neighborhood were incarcerated that day. Compton is just 2.3 miles from Watts. Jerusalem is 5.7 miles from Bethlehem. You would think it was 1 million, given the difference between Herod and a baby named Jesus. What kind of distance will people perceive in us when it comes to the way that we talk about our differences? I often say that the longest trip, now look at me, the longest trip is from here to here. There's a Herod lurking in each one of us. But the birth of Jesus invites us to live more deeply, knowing about the subversion of politics and the power of a baby who we know to be God.